I'm going to be talking to Drew Uchuk, who's a public interest lawyer at the University of Calgary and an expert on oil and gas regulation, somebody I've interviewed many times before in my reporting around the Alberta Energy Regulator and the industry in general. And he and Professor Sean Fluker, also at the U of C, have written a very interesting ABLAWG post titled "The Problem with Industry Control of the Orphan Well Association and OWA Control of Oil and Gas Insolvency." This one might get your blood pressure up a little bit. Drew, welcome to the interview.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I've had you on many times in the past, and I suspect, given what's going on, we're going to have you on many times in the future. There's a lot of change that's happening, and very little of it is good. But this one, let's start with, what is the Orphan Well Association?
The Orphan Well Association is built up through the 90s, and then it coalesces into form it has in the early 2000s. It's an industry-controlled body. So the current board is a representative of Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Pathways Alliance, Canadian Natural Resources Limited, Ember Resources, Paramount Resources, and one representative of the AEU. They determine how the Orphan Well Fund is spent. That's the levy that, not quite a tax, but the levy on oil and gas infrastructure in Alberta used to pay to clean orphan assets, orphan oil and gas infrastructure that doesn't have a solvent owner anymore.
And last year, I understand the levy was about $135 million for industry.
Yeah.
And I think we need to do a little bit of background here, because in our series, Unethical Oil, you and I talked about how the OWA came into existence. And about 30 years ago, the regulator at the time wanted to make some changes around liability management because there were too many inactive wells. There were about 25,000 that were kind of just sitting there, really de facto orphan wells. And the government, the regulator, wanted to go back down the chain so that companies that had sold the wells already, that eventually went bankrupt, they could be liable for the reclamation costs. And the industry didn't want anything to do with that. And it came back with basically the Orphan Fund proposal. So industry itself said, we will look after reclaiming bankrupt licensee assets, correct?
Yeah. And there's two other parts to the possible proposal from the AER. They also said we could be really strict on monitoring transfers. So we could really check the financial quality of people who are buying these wells to make sure that they'll be able to pay for closure. Or we could take upfront security when wells are drilled or when wells are transferred. And industry said both of those would interfere with our operations a lot. Like, we really want a quick review of quality of licensee, and we don't want to post security. So we'll have this really weak upfront system because industry is agreeing to pay for the orphans. It is this huge, supposedly huge backstop. Industry is going to pay for any of the orphans. So if the regulatory system has holes in it, and it was designed to actually have some holes in it, the documents make statements like, the goal is not to stop all assets from being orphaned, but to keep the number of orphans to a reasonable level for the fund. Stuff like that. That's what they expect.
And we should point out that the number of inactive wells went from 25,000 in 2000 all the way up to, in 2020, 97,000. Now, it's since fallen, partly because of changes in the market for gas and partly because of some regulatory changes. But that's still 80,000 wells just sitting there. Some of them have been there for decades, and they're not getting looked after. Whereas the OWA, last time I looked, I think it was like 7,000 wells they had in their inventory. It's not a lot.
Yeah.
But the question here is, who initiates oil and gas licensee insolvencies? Can you explain that?
So this has been a long-term fight in the oil and gas industry over who can initiate, or any party can theoretically, who is a creditor, can initiate an insolvency. But in order to do so, they have to have an incentive that if they start it, they'll be able to recover some of the debt they are owed. So In the Redwater Supreme Court case, which I won't go into the details of it because it became very intricate, it was a bank who had lent to an oil and gas company and wanted to be able to sell the valuable wells for profit and then just leave the worthless wells in the estate of the bankrupt company so that they would be flowed along to the Orphan Well Association so that the financial benefit would pass to the bank. And both the Orphan Well Association and the AER said, no, absolutely not. We can't let the bank who lent money to the oil and gas company drain their money out and ditch the problems on the rest of industry or the Albertan public, but more directly, the rest of industry through the Orphan Well Association.
So, okay, so there have been some changes now, recent changes, and can you explain those to us, please?
So there's a more recent development and there's an older one. The memo is interesting because it sort of provides some history and then it describes the recent one. But in 2017, the AER pushes Lexin into bankruptcy. They almost have no choice because they're getting, if I remember correctly, phone calls from contractors for Lexin saying, these are dangerous wells and no one's getting paid to look at any of them anymore. Like there's nobody around. Either you guys step in and take control of this, or these things are just going to start leaking or blowing up or something. Like, please do something. Because Lexin had just totally was gone. And then after that, some indeterminate time after that, the AER and the OWA come to this agreement where the AER, the Alberta Energy Regulator, will not be pushing companies into bankruptcy. That decision will be left to the Orphan Well Association. And the Orphan Well Association will communicate with the bankruptcy receiver or trustee, the person who assumes control of the corporation's assets to distribute them. And the memo is clear that the purpose of the OWA funding receivership is to optimize the opportunity for assets to be sold or transferred to new licensees and therefore reduce the volume of inventory and its associated costs left to the orphan fund for closure. And that, I think, is very explanatory for what's been going on roughly sometime since Lexin in 2017. When an oil and gas company goes bankrupt, the focus is selling as many as possible of the wells. If they're inactive, if they're marginal, no matter how bad they are, finding a buyer who's willing to take them so that they don't end up immediately the industry's problem in the Orphan Well Association. They go into, and without slandering any company, so I will not say specific names, junk companies who just hold the wells on the land. They might never pay their municipal taxes. They won't close the assets. We might not abandon them. In some cases, they don't ever see them. They don't ever have an employee even go out and check what they look like on the land. It just has to be on their books, so it's not in the orphan inventory. Not every company that takes assets out of a bankrupt estate is going to do that. Some of them actually have a plan to operate it. So I'm not saying every single one, but the incentive was to try to make sure they stayed out of the Orphan Well inventory, however possible.
So if I understand this, we have a public agency or an organization that for which there's not a lot of accountability and transparency. With five of the six board members are industry representatives, and the other one is the regulator, which is considered by many to be captured by the industry. So it's not unfriendly to the industry. And these are the ones that both decide which companies are going to go bankrupt and the assets are put into the OWA inventory and which ones will be sold. And they're also potential buyers of those assets.
So long as they can find a potential buyer. Because for some of the assets, there's not enough to even convince anyone to take it. So the memo includes some specific numbers on how much they were able to get out of. For Trident, they were able to pass 64% of the assets along to new owners. For Houston Oil and Gas, they were only able to pass 25%. For Bow River, 66%, and Sandling, only 28%. So Sandling was in really rough shape. And the last note is that bankruptcy kind of has two meanings here, which might confuse people. One is that they can't pay their obligations as they come due. The other one is that they're pushed into a court-monitored insolvency proceeding where their assets are distributed to creditors.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a moment. If does this not make actually some sense that the assets are not just thrown on the taxpayer, or they don't just go into inactive well list, that they are actually properly disposed of, and that they're, that those wells that have value are sold for as much as they can get. I mean, is that, maybe this is a good thing?
And I think that summarizes what I think, but I'm not totally sure, is the mistake the AER is making. Because no, it isn't. You'd be better with more orphans. The Albertan public would be better if there were more official orphans that industry was paying a higher orphan levy to clean than having them sit in a junk company that's not doing anything with them. They're not paying land rents in some cases. They're not paying their municipal taxes. Those assets should have been sent to the Orphan Well Association. The valuable wells, which can actually be operated for a good profit, should have been sold on to new companies. But what the Orphan Well Association, I strongly suspect, was doing was bundling as many junk assets with the good ones to convince companies to take them, to keep the orphan well inventory low. And
Okay,
that's
so
the difference between the interest of the Orphan Well Association and the Alberta public.
explain again the because it wasn't clear to me anyway, the role of these junk companies, these companies that basically aren't operating, they aren't doing anything, but they hold the worthless assets on their books. How does that work?
They might have some operating assets that they can make money from. So if out of I'll describe a theoretical situation because I can't get the numbers for specifics. But if you imagine a company that goes bankrupt and it has one valuable well, it has 9 other worthless ones. When it goes bankrupt, the receiver could take it and sell it to a company that says, sure, I'll take all 10. And it's going to operate the one valuable well. It will not even look at the other 9. It might never inspect them to even see what condition they're in. And then years down the road, when a valuable well runs out of oil, it will also declare bankruptcy. And now all 10 wells will go back into the bankruptcy process and potentially be returned to the Orphan Well Association. But for all the time that the junk co was sitting on those assets, the Orphan Well Association didn't have to worry about it. And that's the kind of problem that I think the AER was allowing the OWA to do, because the AER should have been supervising this. They should have understood the difference between the industry's interest in protecting the fund and the public's interest in getting timely closure. And the memo repeatedly uses this phrase of the premature asset closure problem in Alberta, the worry about premature closure. You started by mentioning the 78,000 inactive wells. I think 2/3 of the active wells are marginal. In 2019, the AER was aware there was a problem of assets being run at a loss in order to get around LLR regulatory requirements. Lots of those wells are worth nothing, less than nothing. They're garbage. They need to be closed, not kept active by any means possible.
Okay, so let me get this straight. The junk wells in your example, where there are 10 wells, one of them is an operating well, it has value, the other 9 are junk. And where do those 9 wells, on which list do they reside? Are they an active well? Are they an inactive well? Are they
It would
an
be
orphan
inactive.
well? They're not an orphan well. So
They would be inactives. So if the bankruptcy trustee, following the views of the OWA and their concern about premature closure, it would pass the 10 wells so that 9 of them would be inactive, 1 would be active for years, and then that 10th one might also go inactive. But who knows when that company will be petitioned into bankruptcy. So that as long as the wells stay with a company, no matter how much trouble it has meeting its obligations, they don't go into the Orphan Well Association, and industry does not have to pay a levy to clean them.
Now, it's an important distinction here, and it took me a while to understand this, that an abandoned well is not necessarily an orphan well. An orphan well only, it becomes orphan when it's transferred by the AER over to the Orphan Well Association, correct?
Yes, and that's a tricky note because a well that doesn't have a solvent owner is normally what you'd think of as orphaned, got no owner, but not quite, because an official orphan is one that also gets designated into the Orphan Well Association. So if
So
it's
the
sitting there with no owner and nobody's noticed yet, or the AER hasn't noticed yet, it doesn't become an official orphan.
so it sits on the inactive list. Does that mean that it has been properly abandoned? That is, it's been plugged.
Nope, not necessarily. In lots of cases, it might not even be suspended, right? Someone just turned the power switch off and walked away. It might
Okay.
be, it could also be abandoned wells. In the example that I was giving, they would be inactive. They might also have a large inventory of abandoned but unreclaimed wells.
So we don't know, and the AER probably doesn't know. At least I think from previous interviews, you've indicated that the AER really doesn't have a good handle on the condition of the various wells in the various lists. So essentially, if I had to wrap this up for viewers, I would say there's a big problem with asset management, and there are all sorts of things being done to keep them out of the Orphan Well Association, where the industry has to pay, or to keep them off the abandoned list, and just have them sit as junk wells on somebody's balance sheet, and we all pretend that because there's a licensee attached to that well, that somehow the licensee will one day swoop in and reclaim them all,
Yeah.
as was explained to me in various interviews. As long as there's a licensee that well is attached to, then it's considered that everything's okay, the system will work, and it'll eventually be reclaimed. And behind the scenes, with all of these maneuverings going on, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah. And that's the situation from 2017 until April 2024. And then the memo includes an even stranger trick, because the ministerial order from, I think it's the Minister of Energy, but I'd have to check the blog, changes the rule so that assets can't be transferred out of companies that owe more than 20,000 in municipal taxes. And the Orphan Well Association says, we're going to stop even bothering to fund receiverships. We're not going to do it if the municipalities have to get paid before we can transfer any of the assets out, because there's no longer an incentive for us. And the AER, in my view, should have started funding the receiverships themselves, either out of the Orphan Well Fund, which I think they could do, or out of the Alberta Energy Regular Administrative Levy on the oil and gas industry, which comes from basically the same place in the end anyways, to make sure that those companies were pushed into insolvency and their assets distributed to the Orphan Well Association and any valuable assets onto new companies.
So bottom line, when we look at the numbers that the AER publishes on its website, and we've tossed some of them around, like the number in the inactive list, the number in the operating list, is this a way of basically disguising how bad the problem is with all of these environmental liabilities that eventually somebody's going to have to pay to reclaim?
A little bit, because it's most important to keeping wells out of the orphaned category and in the inactive or abandoned, but usually just inactive category. And that's probably part of why the inactive numbers have swelled so enormously, while the orphan numbers have stayed relatively low.
Oh, goodness. Well, okay, so here we have another maneuvering by the AER and the industry to make sure that the burden, the financial burden of reclamation and abandonment and reclamation doesn't fall, as little of it as possible falls on industry. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and I think I'd focus blame on the AER here, because the OWA is industry run. When it was being set up, there was discussions inside the regulator about, is it okay to have this be industry run? And they said, well, we want to supervise how the fund is spent. We want to make sure that we have efficient contractors hired to do well closure. That's fine. That's good. Industry has the expertise to supervise the cost of well closure. Why the AAR let the Orphan Well Association become so involved in controlling insolvencies and this part of orphan policy, that was very unwise.
So essentially, from a taxpayer's point of view, we have the industry that funds the AER, the regulator itself. So it would be very unusual that the regulated entities fund the activities of the regulator. That's clearly it's not a conflict of interest. I'm sure you'll have to come up with a legal term that does describe it. Then on top of that, the Orphan Well Association, which has been taking on a more and more active role, is also funded by industry and controlled by industry.
Yeah.
This looks to me, as an outsider, as a gigantic conflict of interest.
Yeah, I think the AER allowed the OWA to get into a conflict of interest and seems to have still not noticed. There's no indication in the memo that the AER gets that the reason the Orphan Well Association is concerned here is significant increases to orphan inventory and corresponding increase to the orphan fund levy to ensure sustainability and timely closure by the OWA. That's not the public interest. AER should have realized that the OWA was not watching the same thing the AER is supposed to be watching, but they don't seem to have noticed. The OWA shouldn't have been controlling this process.
Well, I'm sure that we will be back talking about AER foibles in the not too distant future. Drew, thank you very much for this.
You're very welcome. Nice talking to you.